Henry Thompson was a 75-year-old black veteran, and today he was sitting quietly at a small corner table in a busy diner. Henry was dressed modestly in a worn but clean jacket, and his hands rested on the cup of coffee he had ordered to pass the time. The diner's atmosphere was lively, with the usual crowd of locals chatting over their meals and enjoying the afternoon. Henry's eyes occasionally drifted to the door as he waited patiently for his son, who was running late. Little did he know that trouble and humiliation were going to walk through the door first. The door to the diner swung open, and two police officers stepped inside, Officer Daniels and Officer Carter. Their badges shone as they walked in, scanning the room for an open table. Their eyes quickly landed on Henry, who was still sitting alone in the corner. Daniels leaned closer to Carter and whispered something with a smirk, and the two officers laughed. To them, Henry seemed out of place. The diner was in a mostly white neighborhood, and it wasn't often they saw someone like Henry here, especially someone old, so they decided to investigate and approached Henry's table without hesitation. Officer Daniels took the lead and sharply asked Henry what he was doing there. There was no greeting or politeness, just a blunt and unjustified demand for an explanation. Henry looked up from his coffee and calmly answered that he was waiting for someone. His voice was steady, and it did not show any discomfort he felt under their scrutiny. Carter chimed in with a mocking tone and told Henry that it was unusual to see a little old black man trying to fit in with the big boys. As he said it, he laughed as if he had made a joke. Henry didn't react to the taunt. Instead, he maintained his composure as he explained again that he was just waiting for his son. But his calmness seemed to irritate the officers even more. Daniels definitely wasn't satisfied with Henry's answer. He leaned in closer and asked to see Henry's ID. It wasn't a request, but a demand. Henry complied and reached into his pocket. He brought out his veteran's ID card and handed it over. He had carried it with him for years, and it was a symbol of his service and the sacrifices he had made for his country. But when Daniels looked at the card, he didn't see a veteran. Instead, he dismissed it with a sneer and shouted that it was probably a fake. Daniels handed the card back with a flick of his wrist, as he clearly did not care about the honor the card represented. Carter agreed with him and commented about how it was hard to believe that someone like Henry could have a veteran's ID, when in Henry's time, people like him only washed dishes or did manual labor. These words were a clear attempt to belittle Henry's achievements and reduce him to a stereotype. Daniels laughed and nodded in agreement. Those had been the good times, when people like Henry knew their place. As far as the cops were concerned, Henry didn't belong in this part of town. Their tone made it clear that they saw Henry as nothing more than an intruder. As the officers continued to harass Henry, the other diners began to notice what was happening. Some glanced over with curiosity, while others listened with discomfort, but no one said anything. The diner's lively chatter quieted down and the atmosphere became very tense. But still, no one intervened. But despite the humiliation he was receiving, Henry remained calm. He had faced worse in his life, and he wasn't about to let these young men break his spirit. But the officers weren't done. Daniels told Henry that if he didn't leave the diner, they would forcibly remove him. They looked like they meant business, and they were ready to back it up with the promise of violence. Henry tried once more to explain that he was waiting for his son, but Daniels cut him off sharply. He didn't want to hear it. To him, Henry was just a troublemaker that didn't belong there. The cops were making it clear that they didn't want anyone like him around the diner. The confrontation had reached a boiling point. The officers were standing over Henry and waiting for him to either leave quietly or give them an excuse to drag him out. But Henry didn't move. He looked at the officers with a steady gaze, with his hands resting calmly on the table. The other diners watched in silence to see what would happen next. Henry knew that he was being humiliated for no reason other than the color of his skin. But he also knew that reacting with anger would only give the officers what they wanted and an excuse to rough him up. So he stayed quiet, hoping that his son would arrive soon and put an end to this needless confrontation. As the seconds ticked by, the officers grew more impatient. They were used to their authority being unquestioned, and Henry's calm resistance and dignity was getting under their skin. Daniels leaned in again and told Henry that he had one last chance to leave the diner on his own. Henry didn't respond immediately. He simply took a sip of his coffee, and when he finally spoke, he told the officers that he wasn't causing any trouble. He was just a man waiting for his son. He had every right to be there, just like anyone else in the diner. Daniels clearly was not expecting this response, and because of that, he was momentarily taken aback. The other patrons in the diner were silent, too afraid or too indifferent to intervene. But there was no denying the tension that had gripped the diner. Henry knew that the situation was spiraling out of control, but he also knew that he couldn't back down. Not after everything he had been through in his life. He had faced prejudice and aggression before, but this was different. He had hoped that his service to the country would earn him some respect, But it seemed that to these young officers, his history meant nothing. So he remained seated in a calm and dignified composure even as the officers loomed over him, waiting for the slightest excuse to act. Suddenly, Officer Daniels reached out and shoved Henry's chair, knocking it over with a loud crash. The noise startled everyone in the diner, and all eyes turned to the scene. The old vet was forced to stand up, yet he still remained calm. Daniels stepped closer and without even giving a warning, he began to pat Henry down roughly. While he muttered that they needed to make sure Henry wasn't hiding anything, his tone implied that he fully expected to find something suspicious. Henry raised his hands slightly, not in surrender but to comply. After all, they were both cops. He had been through situations like this before, where a calm attitude was often the only thing keeping a bad situation from getting lethal. Still, it was hard to ignore the anger bubbling inside him. Henry had been a soldier, a man who had seen combat and survived more than these young officers could probably imagine. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal in his own country. Officer Carter, meanwhile, had picked up Henry's veteran's hat from the table. It was a simple hat that had worn and faded with age. Yet it was a symbol of pride for Henry. Carter looked at it with disdain, then tossed it to the ground as if it were trash. He sneered that old cargo like Henry didn't deserve to wear it. For the first time, anger crossed Henry's face, but he said nothing. He was determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. But the officers weren't done. The diner patrons gasped and some people stood up from their seats in shock. But still, no one intervened, as the two cops clearly meant business. They were known around the area for being bullies. Despite knowing that Henry wasn't trying to reach for anything harmful, Daniel still grabbed Henry's wrist and twisted it behind his back, causing the elderly man to wince in pain. The officers then laughed at the pain Henry felt and joked that he wasn't as tough as he thought he was. Henry gritted his teeth but didn't cry out. He had endured worse pain in his life, both physical and emotional. But what hurt the most was the sheer disrespect he was being shown after everything he had sacrificed for his country. "You are taking this too far," Henry finally spoke up. "You haven't seen half of the horrors I have encountered. I deserve better than this," Henry added. The veteran was only trying to let the cops know that he deserved better treatment, but they saw it as him asking for war. "How dare you? You think you can tell us how to act? We'll show who has power. You are sleeping in a cell tonight for rough handling of innocent cops. Let's see who will save a nobody like you," Daniels mocked. Wasting no time, he produced handcuffs and slapped them on Henry's wrist. But they did not stop there. Carter picked up Henry's walking cane and began looking at it. It was a sturdy old cane that Henry had relied on for years. Without a second thought, Carter did something unexpected. He snapped it in two over his knee and then tossed the pieces aside. He turned to Henry and told him that he didn't need it anymore as he would be in a jail cell soon. The officers began to drag Henry toward the door, but before they could leave, Henry managed to speak. He pointed with his chin toward the small card that was still lying on the table. Daniels was annoyed by the old man's behavior, but he was curious. He snatched the card up, fully expecting it to be something trivial. But when he looked at the card, his face went pale. The card was a simple reservation marker, something that would have meant nothing to anyone else. But written on it in bold letters was the name Commissioner Thompson. The realization hit Daniels like a punch to the gut. The man they had been harassing, humiliating, and physically assaulting was the father of their boss, the police commissioner. All the arrogance drained from Daniel's face as he understood the gravity of their actions. Henry Thompson had lived a long life, one marked by service, sacrifice, and resilience. He had been born in the South during a time when segregation and racism were rampant. Growing up, he had learned early on that the world was not kind to people who looked like him. But Henry had been determined to make something of himself. When the Vietnam War broke out, he enlisted in the army, despite knowing that he would be fighting for a country that didn't see him as equal. During the war, Henry had seen things that no man should ever have to see. He had lost friends, faced death, and fought with everything he had. His service had been honorable, and he had earned the respect of his fellow soldiers. But when he returned home, he found that the respect he had earned on the battlefield didn't translate to the civilian world. He was still just a black man in America, subject to the same prejudice and discrimination he had known all his life. Henry had worked hard to build a life for himself after the war. He had married, raised a family, and taken pride in the fact that his son Robert Thompson had risen through the ranks to become the police commissioner. It hadn't been easy, and Henry had faced countless challenges along the way, but he had never let the world break him. He had always stood tall, even when others tried to push him down. Now, as he was being led away in handcuffs by two officers who didn't know who he was, Henry couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. He had fought for his country and risked his life for its freedom, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Officer Daniels was now fully aware of his mistake. He held the reservation card and he saw that his hands were shaking as he realized the gravity of what they had done. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a career-ending blunder. He let go of the old man and began to stammer out an apology. He tried to explain that they hadn't known who Henry was, as if that somehow excused their behavior. But Henry didn't respond. He simply stood there, waiting for what would happen next. Officer Carter was also visibly shaken. The massive confidence that had fueled their actions was gone, and it was replaced by the cold reality of the consequences they were about to face. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. The shame of their actions was written all over their faces as they stood there, uncertain of what to do next. The other diners, who had been too scared to intervene before, now watched with both relief and anticipation. Some had even pulled out their phones to record what was happening, as they sensed that this moment would not end well for the officers. But Henry still remained calm. He didn't say a word as he watched the officers' expressions change from arrogance to fear. He didn't need to. The name on the card spoke for itself. The officers had humiliated a man who had served his country, a man who had raised a son to become one of the most powerful figures in law enforcement, and now they would have to face the consequences of their actions. Henry had been through enough in his life to know that things had a way of working themselves out, even if it wasn't always in the way you expected. He had faith in his son, and he knew that justice would be served one way or another. He knew that the officers would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Then, the door to the diner swung open, and in walked Commissioner Robert Thompson. He was a tall man with a commanding presence that immediately drew attention. As soon as he entered, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Commissioner Thompson quickly looked around to assess the situation. He saw his father, Henry, sitting quietly at the table while the two officers stood awkwardly beside him. He had faith in his son, and he knew that justice would be served one way or another. He knew that the officers would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Then, the door to the diner swung open, and in walked Commissioner Robert Thompson. He was a tall man with a commanding presence that immediately drew attention. As soon as he entered, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Commissioner Thompson quickly looked around to assess the situation. He saw his father, Henry, sitting quietly at the table while the two officers stood awkwardly beside him. Without a moment's hesitation, the commissioner walked over to his father. He knew what had happened even before he arrived. Someone at the diner had recognized Henry and called him. As Commissioner Thompson approached the table, the eyes of the entire diner followed him. He first turned to his father, and his heart broke at what he saw. He could see the stains on Henry's clothes, the broken cane lying on the floor, and the handcuffs still around his wrists. Despite everything, the old man looked up at his son with pride. His expression was still calm and unshaken. The commissioner then turned to the two officers. He didn't raise his voice, but simply asked them what they thought they were doing. Daniels and Carter had been full of confidence earlier, but now they were stammering, and their faces were pale. They tried to explain, and their words tumbled over each other. They said they didn't know who Henry was and that they didn't realize he was the commissioner's father. Their apologies were weak and full of excuses, but Commissioner Thompson wasn't interested in their excuses. He looked at the two officers with a stern expression and told them that it didn't matter who his father was. Every person deserved respect, regardless of their background or identity. Henry was not only a citizen but also a veteran who had served his country with honor. To treat anyone, especially a veteran, in such a disgraceful manner was unacceptable. Daniels and Carter listened to the commissioner's words, fully aware of the gravity of their mistake. They could feel the eyes of the entire diner on them, and the shame of what they had done was written all over their faces. Commissioner Thompson didn't need to say anything more. His message was clear. Without further delay, he ordered the two officers to leave the diner immediately. They were to report to his office first thing in the morning. There was no need for further discussion or any more apologies. The consequences of their actions were inevitable, and they knew it. Daniels and Carter bowed their heads in shame and left the diner in silence. After the officers had left, Commissioner Thompson turned back to his father. He reached out and gently took Henry's hand in his own to unlock the handcuffs with a key he had in his pocket. As the metal cuffs fell away, Henry flexed his wrists, grateful to be free of the restraints. The commissioner then sat down across from his father, and his expression softened as he looked at the man who had raised him. Commissioner Thompson apologized for being late, and more importantly for the way his father had been treated by his officers. He knew that no amount of apologies could undo the harm that had been done, but he wanted his father to know that he would do everything in his power to make it right. However, Henry wasn't interested in apologies. He looked at his son with pride in his eyes and told him that he was proud of the way he had handled the situation. His son had shown grace under pressure, and that was what truly mattered. The two men sat together in silence for a moment. Despite the pain and humiliation, there was a sense of peace between them. Henry knew that his son was a man of integrity, someone who would fight for what was right, no matter the cost. And the commissioner knew that his father was a man of great strength and dignity, someone who had endured more than most could imagine and had come out stronger on the other side. The incident didn't end when the officers left the diner. Word of what had happened spread quickly throughout the town and beyond. The community was shocked and outraged by the officers' behavior, and many people spoke out in support of Henry and his family. The police department under Commissioner Thompson's leadership launched an investigation into the incident. Daniels and Carter faced swift disciplinary action. They were suspended for 6 months without pay, and they had to attend mandatory retraining on issues of prejudice and respect. The diner incident became a reminder to the community and the police force that prejudice had no place in their town. The commissioner's actions that day set a strong example for his officers and the community, showing that justice and respect must always prevail. For Henry Thompson, the day was a painful reminder of the battles he had fought, both on the battlefield and at home. But it was also a day that strengthened his faith in his son and the values he had instilled in him. Despite the hardships, Henry knew that change was possible, and he was proud to have played a part in making that change a reality. What a story! What do you think about the punishments given to the two officers? Was it too small for their humiliation of an old vet? Tell us in the comments below.